Welcome to GS Podcast number 132. I'm Stephen Knight. Happy New Year, everyone. Hope you had a good one. This is a great conversation to kick off 2019. I'm going to be speaking with author and activist Jacy Reese. We'll be discussing his excellent new book titled The End of Animal Farming: How Scientists, Entrepreneurs and Activists Are Building an Animal-Free Food System. Don't go anywhere, don't run away, it's not what you think. This is not going to be an hour-long lecture on why you should stop eating meat. I'm not going around slapping KFC out of people's mouths or anything. This is something different. This is going to be about innovation and science and new techniques which may lead to alternatives that could completely revolutionise the way we think of meat, the way we consume it, the way we obtain it. So this is things like lab-grown meat or cultured meat, I think is the preferred term. Running side by side with ever increasingly tasty meat alternatives. So this book's really interesting for a number of different reasons. Books on this topic are generally geared around making arguments against meat consumption, and I think I've read enough of them to last me a lifetime, as useful as they are. This book's different. It's more forward thinking. It's talking about solutions and alternatives. There's been quite a lot of focus on personal consumer habits in this area, about going vegan, about becoming a reductarian, reducing your meat consumption, meat-free Mondays, things like that, individual consumer habits. And it's looking more and more likely that we're going to see a systemic solution to this problem, the problem of animal farming, the problem that brings in terms of animal welfare and the impact on the environment and the sustainability issue. So it looks like it's going to be science and industry and technology that brings us a solution to these issues. So it's quite exciting, really. I got a lot from it, and I think you will too. So send Jacy some love, send him some feedback on Twitter at Jacy Reese. Jacy is Jacy and Reese is Reese. Send him some love, send him some feedback. His book is out now and it's wonderful. It's called The End of Animal Farming. You can keep up to date on this podcast at gspellchecker.com. The best way to support it is still through Patron. I've spoke recently about how I've just lost over nearly 30% of my Patron support thanks to their new declarations on hate speech. So if you want to support me, if you've been thinking about it, now would be a great time. You can do that at patreon.com/gspellchecker, or you can do so via PayPal. You can find out how to do that at gspellchecker.com/support. If you can't do any of those things, leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever device you listen to this on. Really helps to make the podcast grow and attract a wider audience. Thank you very much for your support. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took a proper God of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, it goes A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, it don't mean we know, just means we don't believe. And then he keeps telling them he's got this say, a reason shoppers at night will make them run away. But if they start that fight, well, they could go all day. Spell checker, easy, gotta spell check. Now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, 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 A-T-H-E-I-S-T.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Jacy Reese to the GS Podcast. Jacy, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Stephen.
It's entirely my pleasure. I've just got finished reading your excellent new book, which I'm really keen to jump into. Lots of questions for you. But I was wondering, before we start, maybe you could just tell me a little bit about yourself. How would you describe what it is that you do?
So I work for Sentience Institute, which is a small think tank dedicated to the expansion of humanity's moral circle. And by this, we mean we're looking at how humanity considers the interest of different sentient beings. So you can kind of tell all of humanity's history through a story of an expanding scope of moral concern from clans and villages to nation states to a global community of humans across different races and genders, ethnicities, nationalities, as well as now starting to expand to the animal kingdom, thinking about domestic animals like cats and dogs, elephants and tigers used in entertainment, and I believe that the current frontier of humanity's moral circle is the over 100 billion animals in the food system. So that's been the big focus of my work. Really everything I'm doing is motivated from this lens of effective altruism, so a growing movement and mindset and philosophy of using evidence and data and reason and science to do as much good as possible. So to apply the same critical thinking, people like you are now applying to other areas of life, like religion, for example, and trying to use that evidence-based mindset in the area of charity or in the area of doing good in general. So that's the main focus of my career, and my latest book, The End of Animal Farming, focuses on the issue of animal agriculture.
Excellent. Yeah, it's interesting what you say there about applying critical thinking, because I do genuinely believe that was what made me start thinking about animal welfare in a lot more detail and actually give up meat, about seven or 8 years ago it was now. But this is a very difficult conversation to have, isn't it, in the way in which it doesn't tend to win you many friends, because we're starting at a huge disadvantage because the majority of the population, especially in the Western context, consumes meat, and this is considered completely normal and necessary. I think you talk about the four ends in your book as well, from a cultural perspective, from a nutritional perspective. So how do we better have this conversation in terms of trying to move people to a more reasonable place on it? Because I can imagine a lot of people can be just off-put from the very suggestion of maybe being told to consider this topic in a bit more detail.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head in the sense that the movement and perceptions of kind of farmed animal advocacy or the use of animals for food is very centered on individual consumption right now. And in fact, it has been for decades. You could argue this goes back to, the Pythagorean diet, at least to the 1800s, when vegetarianism was seen as asceticism, personal purity, when it was associated with religion, with a lot of individual lifestyle or faith choices. But over the years, I think, especially in the 2010s, we're coming to consider it as a more institutional issue, as a broad social concern, similarly to how we consider other important issues. So with environmentalism, for example, it's rare that you get a conversation that goes, well, I can't really endorse or get on board with environmentalism because I still drive a car or because I still consume fossil fuels. Because the conversation, it has its difficulties, but to a large extent has moved beyond that and instead saying, how can we work through this together? How can we change policy? How can we change what we're collectively doing rather than just individual choices? So I came at this from a research perspective, finding that this was a unique problem in the farmed animal movement, this association with individual diets. But as I started to do more public outreach on the topic and become, I think, an activist myself and write a book called The End of Animal Farming, I've tried to practice what I preach and tried to have the conversation from a more collective lens, and I get remarkably little resistance when I approach it from that angle, especially if you start with factory farming, that specter that everyone is aware of, whether they've seen undercover investigations or they've seen environmental reports on the devastation of animal agriculture. And if you start from that point, it becomes much, much easier.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who consume meat often feel attacked, and for good reason, because occasionally they are actually attacked for their lifestyle choices in regards to consuming meat. I think we just had I think you touch on this issue of tactics in your book quite well, but we've just had an incident in the UK. I don't know whether you saw this or not, but there was
I did.
The steakhouse and the group of vegan activists kind of inserted themselves during this bunch of people eating there and played animal screaming noises over speakers. And I sort of thought to myself, is that going to win any hearts and minds in the long run, or is it just going to create a more negative impression of vegans in general?
Exactly. That particular tactic has undergone a lot of scrutiny and debate over the past few years, and I'm happy to say it has decreased in popularity a little over the past couple of years. And the argument that's made for it is that, yes, you're going into a restaurant, yes, you're disrupting, you're perceived as confrontational, but they're trying not to focus on the individual consumers. They're not pointing to people, yelling at them, telling them, hey, what you have on your plate is murder, you need to stop this and you need to go vegan. So that group, Direct Action Everywhere, instead says and tries to address animal exploitation in general through this collective kind of approach that I was talking about. But the issue is that if you're in a restaurant, just that context itself, the fact that you're yelling where people are eating, the perception, if not the intent, is about individual diets. It's about those consumers and the meat they have on their plate, which is just not a healthy starting point.
Okay, well, one of the things I really love about your book, it's kind of very forward thinking in the way that it doesn't deal overtly with the negatives of factory farming in general. It sort of talks about solutions and innovations and ways in which we can get to a sort of post-farming future in a way. And before we jump into all that, one thing I wanted to just try and make clear to listeners is the factory farming system in general and how that works, because I think when we talk about animal welfare in this context, a lot of people tend to assume that only relates to when things go wrong in the factory farming system, when there's been, rogue employees not doing things they should, or there's been specific abuses. But I think that's kind of by the by. I think if we were to talk about the system in the way in which it, in a way which it completely runs smoothly and everything's within the legal parameters of that system, it's still animal torture in that sense, isn't it?
Yeah, this historically has been a big challenge of the movement because initially in, roughly speaking, the 70s and the 80s, you had awareness of government reports, of actual industry standards, of kind of the hard figures of, how large is a shed and how many chickens are in that shed, therefore how tightly are these animals confined, which gives you a sense of the sort of misery involved. But not many people listened to that. It was just kind of cold, hard figures. Nobody except the animal agriculture industry themselves had been inside of those farms. So what you started to see was a lot of undercover investigations, especially in the United States, and then increasingly so in Europe, and now even in regions like Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But when you got those investigations, it's very easy to see one of those on a late night TV special, see them on Facebook, and say, oh, wow, that's horrific. I agree that's animal cruelty. I am strongly opposed to that, but that's not the meat I consume. In fact, a survey we did at Sentience Institute last year of U.S. adults showed that 75% think that the meat they eat comes from animals who were treated humanely, despite this widespread awareness that factory farming exists in some extent and there's a lot of suffering. So now we're kind of having to bridge the gap between these two different things to connect the emotional awareness, the viral news stories of specific examples and say, no, actually, this is rampant. And one of the ways to do this is just they've had so many investigations so far, and every farm that people go to try and document it, to try and get a job on these farms, for example, so you can have a hidden camera and expose what's going on, they do find cruelty. They've even went to so-called humane farms, RSPCA, for example, in the United Kingdom, or the many certifications we have in the United States, and still seen this cruelty. But the facts are that there are over 100 billion animals in the food system today. Globally, the best estimates suggest over 90% of them live on factory farms, where a factory farm is defined as a high concentration of animals on a single location. It's kind of the best simple definition we can use, and it depends on the specific population. So, for example, with cows, you might think that just having over 1,000 of them is enough to make it a factory farm, whereas with chickens, you might have to get into the tens of thousands or even up to 100,000 to think of it as a real industrial location. In the U.S., over 99% of animals raised for food live on factory farms. That's actually has much better data than other countries because the U.S. Department of Agriculture keeps track of the number of animals per farm. It's kind of unique in the United States. And then on these farms, through those investigations, through what the industry will even say themselves about their standard practices, you have mutilation. So you have beaks and tails cut off without anesthetic. You have intense confinement, just a small amount of space. In addition to many animals being in cages, even in places like much of Europe, where they've moved away from so-called battery cages, where it's 4 to 7 hens inside of a small enclosure, and now they're in so-called colony cages, where it's a larger number of hens in a larger space. So it ends up with a pretty similar amount of space per individual, or even a cage-free farm. You still have a similar amount of animals per space, and in fact, cage-free farms have many issues that cage farms don't have. So, for example, they'll stir up the ammonia, they'll stir up the feces, the litter on the ground, and this creates really poor air quality and a lot of respiratory issues that aren't as present in cage systems. So I mean, I could go through various facts and figures like that, but the fact is that, in most countries today, maybe not a few low-income countries, factory farming, torture essentially of these animals is the standard, and any deviation from that is a tiny minority, and it's usually much more expensive than the factory farm products.
Yeah. I mean, that's everything I've looked into on this topic has just revealed that time and time again. But people will often say, well, I get my meat from the local family-run farm. It's a humane farm, and it's free range. Things like this are thrown out organic, and I think, I mean, it's safe to say that kind of happy animal farm is a myth, isn't it? It's very difficult to, well, nigh impossible to actually get meat or animal products from a humane source.
Exactly. I mean, I think there are a lot of consumers who, with some portion of their animal product consumption, choose some more humane label, cage-free, pasture-raised, something like that. But when you interrogate people, when you quiz them about what's your actual day-to-day consumption, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I bought grass-fed beef, the stuff that I cook at home from my local farmer's market, or even the farmer down the road, or even a family member, for example." But then you say, "Okay, well, what did you have for lunch today?" And they say, "Oh, I went out to a restaurant, maybe a fast food chain." Okay, well, did you ask them where that comes from? And they'll say, "Oh, no." And you get to the point where really most people at least aren't regularly consuming those products. And even if you go to those kind of best of the best farms, you still see all sorts of issues. And I'll talk to farmers about them. For example, the fact that, a lot of egg farmers will still use the breeds of chickens that lay over 300 eggs per year, jumbo-sized eggs usually, and that really wreaks havoc on their health and their welfare. In fact, I have 2 hens at home with me right now who are rescued from battery cage farms. But even on those humane farms, they still use that breed of chicken. So even if that animal is out on pasture, even if that animal is fed a better diet, for example, they still have those reproductive issues. And there are just a lot of intractable problems that I think make animal agriculture encourageable. This isn't the view that I came to with my research. I wanted to address factory farming itself. In fact, I first wanted to write a book on the end of factory farming. But then as I looked into so-called humane animal farms, I found more and more issues and felt that the best solution was an animal-free food system.
Yeah, my sister has 3 rescue hens herself, and she's not a vegetarian, but she's someone who's very thoughtful, and she's giving more thought to this topic, and she's sort of reduced her meat consumption. But it's interesting that as soon as she got these hens and kind of fell in love with them, and they're sort of part of the family now, she can no longer eat chicken.
Yeah.
So I always joke that I just need to get her a pet cow now for Christmas and just keep expanding the farm. But you touch on this issue in your book a bit, don't you? I mean, it's difficult for people to get a picture of something that's on such a mass scale in terms of animal welfare, whereas if you boil it down to individual stories and people, when you're discussing this issue, that can have a bigger effect on people's mentality.
Exactly. Actually, so Dylan Matthews, a writer at Vox, tweeted just today or yesterday that he thinks maybe the defining problem of our time is psychic numbing, is the failure to have compassion or concern for large numbers of suffering individuals. And you can look into the psychology of this and try to understand why it is. For example, I talk a lot about the collapse of compassion, which kind of refers to people's loss of concern for a large solution where they don't see a large problem where they don't see that large solution. So we can kind of feel like our emotions will be wasted if we care about a big problem like animal agriculture if it can't be solved. And I think this is a big argument for that solution focus that we discussed initially, is to show people a path forward, show that we actually could end animal farming within our lifetimes, or in factory farming, or make big changes beyond just our own diet. People will feel like it's a drop in the bucket. They'll feel very demotivated. And I think the challenge of a lot of one-on-one advocacy is to build a bridge in some way, connect them with their childhood dog, and then talk about how pigs are actually more intelligent than dogs in many ways. And maybe that just initially gets them to abandon pork products or to abandon chicken products. But it can can be a lever which you use to connect them to this broader issue. See the individuals in the group rather than seeing an abstract group of individuals. And I think that psychologically, that's a big step in creating a wide movement. Opening a big tent that includes people, who are just reducitarian, aren't fully vegetarian, or maybe they don't even want to change their own consumption, but they're an entrepreneur who could start one of the next, animal-free food companies. And that would be really great to have them on board. And right now, the movement doesn't include them to a large extent. Great.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the more promising aspects of this in the food industry then, because it seems like there seems to be a growing industry of so-called mock meats or meat alternatives, perhaps, and then there's something entirely different, which I think you've decided on cultured meat as the preferred term for it. And I must have sampled every mock meat product in the UK, and we're actually a little bit behind the curve compared to the States. I mean, we only just got the Beyond Burger was officially launched in the UK this month. So I tried it. I was very impressed with that. It was a little bit unsettling given how close it was. I'm not sure I could have that as often because I've kind of developed an aversion to meat now. But so, I mean, in a way, we could win hearts and minds a bit more by producing better quality meat alternatives that sort of fill the taste hole left by giving up meat. And I was wondering, how are we doing on that score, do you think? Will we get to a point where we can produce something that's completely plant-based, that's indistinguishable from meat?
I think so. So there's a few arguments here, kind of in the long term. So one is that what we think of as the distinguishing tastes and textures and even nutritional profile of meat or dairy or eggs aren't unique to the animal kingdom. So, for example, the Impossible Burger, the sister product, the sister company even of the Beyond Burger, they use an ingredient called heme, which is similar to hemoglobin, what we find in an animal's blood that carries iron, that gives red meat a lot of its metal, irony taste that people will identify as really the core of the red meat experience. But they found soy like a hemoglobin, so an analogous compound in soy roots and soy root nodules. And they add this to their concoction of plant ingredients like wheat and potato to create something that is, to many people, already indistinguishable from animal-based beef. I'd say that there's a lot of variation even between different beef burgers. Obviously, you can go from a McDonald's hamburger to a gourmet grass-fed burger, and there's a huge difference. And I think the difference between the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger is and the average beef burger is no wider than the differences that already exist within animal-based beef burgers. So I think it's a large part of the way there. And these products are still so young. We're still seeing the maybe 1.0 or maybe 2.0, I don't know, of these products, and they definitely have the capacity to go a lot farther than they have. We're now seeing Beyond Meat, for example, the makers of the Beyond Burger, announce an IPO and an initial public offering to grow a ton as a company. And that would allow them resources that are still just a tiny fraction of the overall, food science industry. So just thinking what they could do once they get to these larger scales, right now they need these early adopters like you and like me and like listeners who are willing to pay a little extra to try these new products. But eventually they're going to compete by just being the same price or in fact cheaper and taste the same and maybe be better for the environment, better for nutrition, and of course better for the animals. So I am pretty optimistic about the plant-based burgers. I would, if I had to guess, what will displace, more than 20% of animal farming's market share. I think it will end up being cell cultured meat to do that. The terms vary a lot: cell cultured, clean meat, lab grown meat, cell based meat. I'm not a fan of lab grown or test tube or Franken, the things that are really sound off putting and artificial. Yeah, I think they're just they're both misleading. Calling it lab grown, for example, all food is kind of first researched and developed in a food science laboratory. That's how the modern food industry works. So we wouldn't say lab grown Cheerios. So why would we say lab grown meat? But anyway, cultured meat I think is really promising. And while the technology is further off, it might be commercialized, have its first sales in the next year or two. It's going to take 5, maybe 10 years for it to be as available as the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger are now. But when that does happen, I think it's going to scale up really quickly. And I think these plant-based products are gateway and are opening up consumers to understanding that your protein, your meat, and your center of the plate doesn't have to come from animal agriculture.
Well, let's just nail down for a second what we mean by cultured meat, and then what distinguishes it from plant-based meat alternatives. It is actually derived from an animal, isn't it? But doesn't require a factory farming system or a farm of any kind in order to produce it.
Exactly. So it comes from animal cells. You take a small sample of cells from a living animal that can be taken from animals who are around today, on a farm. It could be taken from animals on a sanctuary, but you just need a small amount. And then you place those cells in the same environment that you would find inside an animal's body. So this would probably look like a beer brewery at scale, some sort of fermentation facility, where you have these big tanks. And inside you'd have the cells, you'd have sugar, so some sort of energy for the cells. You'd have nutrients, so the building blocks they need to proliferate, and then growth factors. So growth factors are molecular signals inside an animal's body that tell cells when to grow and how to grow. And they're really important because they're very expensive right now. They're mostly available in the biomedical industry at small scales. And that's where a lot of the research in this industry is how we can mimic that part of kind of the animal body environment to produce meat itself. So the end product is meat and down to the molecular level. With dairy and eggs, you could use different processes. So actually we make synthetic insulin today for diabetics using microorganisms that produce the same compound that animals would produce. And we could use that process to produce acellular products like fluid milk or to create cheese or other dairy products. And then to make egg whites, at least, egg yolks are pretty tough. But yeah, those are also really exciting and could come even sooner. So Perfect Day Foods, the big dairy group who's making, again, real whey protein, real casein protein, without the use of animals, already has an agreement with one of the biggest food ingredients companies, ADM, in the US, to work with them to commercialize their products.
And how would this product compare to animal flesh in terms of nutrients and in terms of protein and B12 and iron and things like that?
So it should be molecularly identical, in which case it should have the B12, but it should also have the cholesterol and the saturated fat and some of the things people don't want. And this is one of the reasons it's seen as often a gateway product by vegans who want everyone to switch to a whole plant-based foods diet, often for nutritional reasons, sometimes sustainability, is because it does have some of the downsides of conventional meat, but a tiny, tiny fraction of them. You're still not using animals. You're using well over 90% less land, fewer natural resources, less energy. So I still think it's a big win. There's also discussions, from the more scientific, foodie and tech Silicon Valley folks to do things like change the kind of fat that cells produce. So this might include genetic engineering, in which case it'll be a lot harder to sell to the public. But you could have them produce, for example, omega-3 fatty acids instead of omega-6 fatty acids in a beef product, in which case it's not the same as what people are getting today, but it might be even better. Cholesterol, for example, doesn't really contribute to the nutrition, or obviously nutrition, but the taste or the texture of animal products. So we could take that out pretty easily through something like genetic engineering. I mean, I think it's to be determined whether consumers will want that. I think right now the thrust of the industry and the priority needs to be just providing people with the exact same molecules, the exact same cells that they're used to. But after that, who knows? I mean, the sky's really the limit.
Yeah, I mean, I always find it really amusing that people are quite squeamish about this idea of that they'll term it the quote-unquote lab burger, as they'll do, they invoke the appeal to nature fallacy, and they're a little bit squeamish about trying something that's not natural, yet they'll consider meat derived from the factory farming system to be natural on the other hand. And maybe you can point out a few ways in which that's quite, wrong-headed.
Yeah, that's right, Stephen. And it's challenging to the extent that I've heard some people argue we need to overcome people's aversion to unnatural foods and kind of succeed in getting people to accept forms of genetic engineering that are actually really good for people and for animals and the environment. And then we'll be able to have widespread adoption of cultured meat. I'm a bit more optimistic than that, but I see an argument for it. I mean, I do think that the main roadblock will be getting people to understand, A, how unnatural, factory farming is, or indeed all modern animal agriculture. Like I mentioned with the breeding of these animals, even on humane farms, it still doesn't look like what it used to, and it's still not good. The argument I like to make is that cultured meat is natural in all the ways that matter. So when we think about why do we care about naturalness, is it food safety? Is it sustainability? Is it cultural and tradition? I think cultured meat succeeds on those aspects. I do think it might confront some cultures who see the slaughter of animals or the farming of animals as an important part of what they think of a natural diet. That's kind of an inevitable consequence, and I think we're just going to have some evolutions and transitions and cultural practices. Like where I'm from in the southern United States, where barbecue and where killing the animals you raise in your backyard for kind of a family celebration is a big part of things. But I am optimistic that we'll overcome those, and I think a big part of it is just going to be the moral outrage we have right now at animal agriculture as an unnatural system today.
Okay, so I suppose the deal breaker for most people considering this topic, and it was a big problem for me, and that's the big C word, cheese. And I must have sampled hundreds of vegan cheeses, and I used the word cheese very lightly there. And I was just wondering, how far are we on this front in creating a very authentic tasting cheese replacement, do you think?
Yeah, so it's actually weird. Europe does a lot better in a lot of ways when it comes to the plant-based market, but not cheese at all. So Europe has lots of oil-based cheeses, meaning they're a sliced cheese usually or shreds. They can kind of melt. They could kind of be on a lunch sandwich, but they're not. They don't really have that cheesy, tangy flavor or anything close to that. Yeah. The U.S. has two types. So we have those oil-based cheeses like Daya, for example, but we also have some emerging kind of nut cheeses. So Treeline, Miyoko's, these sorts of companies. And these are a round of cheese. They're something you can put on a cracker. They have that tanginess. I wouldn't say they're indistinguishable, and cheese is just a really hard product from a culinary perspective. The bacteria, for example, that are used with dairy proteins and fats today to create cheese don't work as well when you just apply them to the proteins and fats in a nut, like a cashew, for example. So it is tough. But these nut cheeses like Miyoko's, I think, are much further along. But I do think Perfect Day Foods, that company I mentioned before, is going to be what really succeeds in a sense of providing people with what they feel, what they identify as a cheesy flavor. So, for example, casein. Casein is pointed to as the addictive component of cheese, and in many ways, it actually is. I mean, the thing that lots of vegans like to say is it functions similar to cocaine. I mean, that's a bit debatable how good the similarity is there. But I think once you're able to actually produce that, once you can produce it, once you can produce whey, you can then create even yogurt, even something like brie cheese. So brie is something that's pointed to a lot as something that you can't really find at all anywhere, anything close to it. But I think we'll be able to get those stinky cheeses once we just literally have the same proteins. And fortunately, that is much easier than cultured meat because it's using an established scientific process that's been used to produce, like I said, insulin. It's also used to produce rennet. Rennet is the component of cheese that makes a lot of it non-vegetarian because traditionally
full of the stuff, I think, isn't it?
Exactly. So the component of that chymicin is actually something you could produce with microorganisms in the same way. So I think we'll see that happen over the coming years. I'd say within 5 years, within a decade maybe, we'll have something. Again, maybe the aim here is to have it be as available as the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger, still with a lot of room to scale. That is cheese in the cheese sense of the word.
Okay. You also talk a lot about institutional change rather than individual change in your book, and I think you mentioned it at the start of the conversation as well. The way in which we can petition institutions and trying to influence the way they operate rather than focusing on individual consumer habits, and I think that's a very valid approach and probably the most useful one. But is it possible that might produce a little bit of apathy in the sense that you could say to yourself, well, why should I quit meat when we've got all these alternatives on the horizon? I just need to bide my time and then things will change on their own and I can enjoy my meat in the meantime. Do you think that's a valid way to look at the issue?
Yeah, I think it's a valid way, and I think it is one of the downsides of the institutional approach, or indeed maybe a downside of the whole technological approach, in fact. I think the upsides outweigh it. So actually on Sentience Institute's website, we go through a lot of the big debates people have had in the farmed animal movement and try to lay out the the evidence in favor and against. And there are a few good arguments, I think, against institutional change. You pointed out one of them. Another one is that it lacks a clear call to action. So when you have a vegan movement, and that's the identifier and that's the slogan, is something like Go Vegan, there's no question of what you want people to do. But if you're talking about institutional change, it's unclear how people can individually participate. I mean, I think it's a lot of the same things people do for other issues. You can share content online, you can sign petitions, you can join campaigns, whether those are corporate or political. You can call your legislatures, you can volunteer for an organization, work full time even for them if you're up for a career switch. But it is less clear. You know, there are a lot of options, and that can kind of be overwhelming to people. In the same way, if you present these technologies as kind of solving the problem, or if, I write a book called The End of Animal Farming and argue that it's inevitable that this movement will succeed, that can lead to some apathy. But I do think it's ultimately outweighed. I think a lot of people want to be on the right side of history. They want to join with others. They want to fight for a collective action. They want to unite in that sense. That does make the institutional approach overall more compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the most recognizable brands and movements around veganism and animal welfare would be PETA, and they obviously have very mixed and often controversial tactics, and you actually single them out for a fair bit of criticism in your book. And I was wondering, maybe you could explain to people why you think some of their work isn't entirely productive in terms of moving people to a more reasonable place.
Yeah, so it all centers on the use of what I would call gimmicks. So gimmicks are seeking attention at the cost of reputation. And all social movements use these to some extent. Big environmental organizations right now, for example, will do stunts like hanging a big sign from a skyscraper or from a crane or something, trying to grab a lot of attention, even if he makes it you come off as crazy or aggressive or weird or something like that. But there's always a balance. And in all social movements, we need the right allocation of resources. And I think what an activist needs to do, whether they're fighting for secularism or for animal rights or anything else, is see what's been used a lot in the movement and what's been maybe used too much, and try and steer away from that approach. And I think the animal movement has used a lot of gimmicks. They've gotten a lot of attention at the cost of reputation, to the point where today the bottleneck for change, when I talk to activists about what is limiting your ability to affect change in whatever area they're working in, a lot of it comes from the reputation of the animal movement. If you're a vegan, or if you're a farmed animal advocate, or even an advocate for cats and dogs or animals used in circuses, you get pointed to a lot, and there's a concern that, that's weird. As a company, think of a big food company who might adopt a meatless Monday policy. They don't want to identify with animal rights as much as they want to identify with sustainability or with human health, obviously. And I think right now we need to focus more on engendering a reputation as a serious social movement, as one that's not antagonizing other movements. Secularism and especially atheism itself has had these issues as well, with sometimes seeing as running up against feminism or other social issues, but instead being seen as just kind of the next step in the growth of human morality or human rationality in some way. So I want to see the movement shift away from that. I do think there's there's a reason for optimism. So I talk to a lot of people, even at PETA itself, who get a lot of flack from their friends and family because of the tactics of PETA. And, they'll say, PETA does a lot of different things. I don't work on that. Or they'll say, for example, that, it's for example, when they have the I rather go naked than wear fur campaigns, they'll say, those are women, running these campaigns, obviously appearing in these campaigns and supporting these campaigns, so that makes it okay. But then they have to confront that that's not the perception of them. People don't see it as a feminist movement, as, grabbing onto your bodily liberty to use it in that way. Instead, they see it as antagonizing feminism. And that's just the brute fact that we have to deal with, I think, in the movement. And I think people are starting to recognize that even at PETA itself. And as we see a new vanguard of the movement, as the founders of animal rights start to retire, I think you'll have a new generation who moves on from some of the mistakes. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of things people did right, and I don't want to diminish that in the early stages of the movement. But any time when you get a new generation emerging as the leaders of a social movement, you get a lot of improvement because people are just woefully aware of the mistakes of their predecessors.
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful answer. In a sense, is the Is the term vegan or messages like "go vegan" a problem because it's very specific and narrowly focused, whereas you're very focused on ending animal farming in its totality? So that's going to take people who eat meat, people who don't eat meat, everyone in between. It's best to encourage people who eat meat still advocate for animal welfare and changes to the animal farming system. So would you say, to be more specific and more focused, it's best just to gather around the banner of ending animal farming in totality?
Exactly. I mean, there's room for multiple messages here. We can focus on ending animal farming. You could focus on ending factory farming or various, of the harmful facets of animal agriculture. But in general, focusing on institutional and collective change. In fact, that poll I mentioned earlier, where 75% of U.S. adults said they regularly consume humane animal products, in that same poll, we found that 47% of U.S. adults support a ban on slaughterhouses, which is a really, really crazy notion. I mean, granted, people are willing to say a lot of crazy things on surveys, but still, you wouldn't expect, certainly maybe 10% of the population at most identifies as vegetarian. 47% means a lot of full omnivores are recognizing slaughterhouses as a bad thing and have some aversion to them, and might be willing to support this movement in some way. When we see ballot initiatives, for example, in the U.S., so signatures and citizen movements to pass new laws for farmed animal welfare, you get large majorities of support. Some of the largest majorities we get, given there's so much gridlock in general in the U.S. So 77.7% of Massachusetts voters wanted to ban the use of cages on farms for animals. A more recent initiative, actually, this month in California, it had a 61% yes vote to do a similar measure for farmed animal welfare. So I think you can get a large amount of support, and it's a kind of a resource almost that just the farmed animal movement isn't tapping into. And I think with these technologies and with the changes in mindset, we're on the cusp of a recognition of that massive resource in the movement. And I think it's cause for optimism of what's going to happen in the 2020s and the 2030s and really how animal agriculture is going to end globally by the end of the century.
Okay, yeah, I mean, you speak a fair bit in your book about how when these plant-based meat alternatives were just startups and starting out and actually making progress in the market space, established people within the meat industry had sort of used underhanded tactics to try and damage their brand, or things as far as trying to copyright the word mayo and have exclusive rights over certain terms and things like that. And now what we're seeing is a little bit of a shift where meat industry companies are actually investing in these vegan startups and things like that. Do you think that's particularly good for the plant-based food industry?
Yeah, I think in fact that's probably the biggest sign of progress and going to be the biggest mechanism of change. Tyson Foods, the world's second largest meat processor, and Cargill, another food giant, have both invested in some of these new companies, and that's really promising because historically vegans and farmed animal advocates thought they would have to reinvent meat, protein. They would have to take down $1 trillion industry globally. And that's a ambitious goal to say the least. It seems much easier to help the industry pivot. The same way oil companies are now identifying as energy companies. And I mean, it's to be determined how well that will go. We're seeing meat companies identify as protein companies and start to get on board with plant-based food and indeed with these cultured meat products. And I think that's how things are going to end up changing, because it's much harder to just have a startup who has their own production facility, distribution, marketing, branding, business connections, all of these things. It's much easier to have these startups in the field create the Beyond Burger, create the Impossible Burger, or these initial cultured meat products, and then use the infrastructure of a big food company to spread it to the masses. I think there's still a bit of room for technological development. I guess that up until 2025, we're still going to be kind of in the R&D stage, in the early adopter stage. But at that point, I expect to see more widespread progress and these food companies actually incorporating these products into their mainstream offerings.
Okay, I mean, where do you fall on this whole debate as to whether or not to refer to it as meat or label it meat? And I know this can anger a few people when I mention, plant-based meats, and I'm often told that that's not meat, my friend. They get very defensive about it. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I think it will happen. I think, from an empirical sense, it just once people are eating that as even a large minority of their consumption, but especially once it becomes the majority, it will just make sense to refer to it as meat. It's the same culinary role. It's a similar nutritional profile. All of these things. Right now, I think a lot of people are willing to eat these products, basically no matter what they're called. In Missouri, in the United States, they passed a law, in fact, saying that meat has to come from an animal's carcass. It's a bit debatable what that means about products called plant-based sausage, for example. Sausage isn't exactly the word meat, but it might be pretty similar in Europe. So France has passed a similar law, and then the European Union has made some restrictions on milk, especially soy milk having to be called something like soy beverage, for example. But people are still drinking it. People still recognize what it is. I think they're going to continue to be early adopters of these products. I think it's when we face the later stages when we'll have to really debate these things and struggle with them. But a lot of this, I think, has to do with the initial commercialization of cultured meat. And when that happens, I think there's a really good case for calling it meat for nothing else than just the allergen concern. So if it's not labeled as meat, if it's not labeled as eggs, as seafood, people are going to get sick. People are going to die. And there's just a very clear case for calling what it is at the molecular level. I think that the lab-grown designation or the cell-cultured kind of adjective that goes before that is a bigger question. But I think overall you will see positive labeling for these products, and it's just important that by 2040 and by 2050 we are calling them what they are, because there are many people in the marketplace who aren't going to change for ethical or even health reasons, and those people will need to get on board because they understand from the label that it is the same product that they're used to eating. But I am an optimist in the sense that I do think that will happen.
I mean, I suppose one of the things that it is best to make people aware of is that it's not just necessary for animal welfare reasons to sort of do away with the current meat producing system we have, but in terms of the environmental impact, it is an unsustainable model in that sense. When you talk about the ever growing population and you talk about non-Western countries adopting a similar factory farming system to the United States, and we're in big trouble really if we keep heading in that direction, aren't we?
Yeah, and in fact, when I debate with other experts in this field the specific timelines of when things might happen, a big factor is just the rate of environmental destruction, and I think that will be a big motivator simply due to self-interest. Many people aren't willing to change because of ethical concerns, whether those are long-term environmental or animal or something else, or for example public health with antibiotic resistance. That can even seem abstract, but once you have rising temperatures and increased natural disasters, there becomes much more of an impetus to tackle the real environmental harms. So the elephants in the room that we've been ignoring so far. I mean, animal agriculture contributes more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector, and yet you see such a focus on electric cars and things like this. And I think we'll just be forced to apply a similar focus to the use of animals for food. I should say that as a skeptic myself, I don't buy all of the arguments in favor of ending animal agriculture. So with nutrition, for example, which a lot of people will point to as a big area of people's self-interest, people want to be healthier. I think that the nutrition evidence we have right now is just pretty crappy, to say the least. And I'm not convinced we need to be cutting down on saturated fat or maybe even dietary cholesterol and these things. But I think the case is a lot stronger at its core, the animal welfare argument from an ethical perspective, but then these sustainability arguments and the public health arguments like antibiotic resistance and pollution that causes asthma and cancer to local communities around, in particular, factory farms.
Yeah, I'm with you on the nutritional aspects. I think it's not particularly helpful for people to peddle veganism as some catch-all cure to all your ailments or weight problems or things like that. I mean, one of the things that struck me in the book as well was the waste and the fact that, you point out the statistic that you need something like 10 calories to produce 1 calorie of meat or something like that. And I was just wondering how a business remains profitable when when it sort of operates in that way? Because I often think if it was any other business, it would probably fold. How does the meat industry keep operating under such massive overheads and waste?
Yeah. So first, I mean, those caloric conversion rates and protein conversion rates or any of the conversion rates that are used in this field have been cut down a lot. That is kind of the point of factory farming in a sense, is that it's just too expensive to feed people with pasture-based or whatever sort of animal agriculture system. So there has been a drive towards efficiency and a drive towards reducing costs. But you've also seen it buoyed by federal subsidies, buoyed by just a consumer demand for meat, dairy, and eggs, by things like I'm not actually sure what there's been in the UK, but in the US we have Got Milk, Beef It's What's for Dinner, The Incredible Edible Egg. These are slogans that any American consumer, of the appropriate age, I guess, will recognize because they've been drilled into our heads and made us, crave and need and see as a core part of our diet these animal products. And I think it's going to be really important to tackle those pillars on which animal agriculture currently stands. And just, again, this is a big argument for providing people with plant-based or cell-cultured meat, dairy, and eggs, helping them align their behavior with their values because there's just such a craving, such a demand for the animal products themselves, even if it is inefficient. But I do think that's perhaps the strongest argument over a period of decades or centuries for animal farming to end, is just that sheer inefficiency. If we think of expanding to the stars, if we think of a technologically advanced society that has a much greater understanding of biology and various sciences, why would we keep using animals for food? In the book, I interviewed Alexander Lorestani of Geltor. So they're one of the companies using that microorganism process to produce actually collagen. So they're already selling products to the pharmaceutical industry instead of getting collagen from animals. And he said that he was motivated to start that company just by technical outrage. So I spoke of moral outrage as a big motivator against factory farming, but he just thought it was absurd and dumb that we continue to use animals for food. And you have this new generation of people looking for the next big startup in Silicon Valley who are looking for broken industries. And increasingly, they're seeing animal agriculture as one of these. Y Combinator, for example, a big startup incubator in the Valley, now has as one of their focus areas animal-free food, because they see it as not just an ethical imperative, but as a business opportunity. And I think that's a big motivator of change, for better or worse.
Okay, I think I'll end on a little bit of a curveball, and this is something that comes up to me personally because I own 3 cats, and they were part of my family before I decided to give up meat. But as far as I'm aware, the latest information tends to suggest that they're that meat consumption for them is necessary. So how do we solve this issue of having pets and kinship with animals, yet needing to know they have to be sustained by animal products too?
Yeah, so first I should say that I'm not very convinced on the nutrition evidence for pets. I mean, even less convinced than I am for humans. We just really don't understand exactly what they need. So while you can, for example, get taurine from animal-free sources, taurine is kind of seen as the key thing obligate carnivores need, but in particular cats, that they can't find in a at least whole plant-based foods diet. But I don't think we have a great understanding that will allow a cat to not just survive, as many vegan cats do, but thrive. I think the case for dogs is clear. They aren't obligate carnivores. They can synthesize the molecules they need, the nutrients they need from plant-based sources. But I think right now it's just not the priority, to tackle the pet food industry, at least in the sense of these people who are, like you, cutting down their own consumption or going vegetarian or going vegan, but have a cat who consumes, a small amount of animal products. The same way I don't prioritize, tackling animal agriculture or hunting in low-income countries or in cultures who see that as more of their traditions and their cultures. I think that will be tackled eventually. I think decades from now we will have cultured meat, which we can feed to cats, obviously, because it has the same molecules, all of them that conventional meat does. But until that stage, I think the big focus focus is on, beef burgers. It's on chicken nuggets. It's on chicken tenders, which are actually pretty easy products to produce using plant-based or cell-based methods. One of the most exciting food companies that people haven't heard about is called Seattle Food Tech, and all they're doing is using existing plant-based technology to produce tons and tons of chicken nuggets, because this is easy. It's a huge amount of animal products. Chickens in particular suffer so intensely and at such large numbers that I think that needs to be the focus. And I think people shouldn't worry so much about, switching the diet of their cats, even though that will come in the long run.
Yeah, that's absolutely a secondary issue for now. Jacy, this has flown by. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Is there anything else you wanted to get across at all before I let you get back to your afternoon?
Not really. I would say that, my focus here is effective altruism. And I think whether that means focusing on animal agriculture, which I think is one of the world's most pressing problems, or other issues like global health, like malaria, or like future technologies and things like nuclear weapons. There are a lot of big issues that effective altruists focus on. And I think it's a great community for people to join, a great, resource, having a global community of thinkers on that topic. So I'd encourage people to get more involved with that. There's a book called Doing Good Better, written by William McCaskill, that serves as a fantastic introduction to the topic. And I hope people get more involved.
Excellent. Well, I really enjoyed your book, The End of Animal Farming, which is out now, and very grateful for your work. You obviously know your stuff, and you're very passionate. So I'm very glad someone like you is out there advocating for animal welfare and change in that sense.
Thank you, Stephen. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks, Jacy. Thank you for listening to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a Patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?